Kalorama, a recorded books Highbridge imprint, presents The City is Up for Grabs. How Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot led and lost a city in crisis. By Gregory Royal Pratt. Read by Christopher Douyard. Prologue. Checkers. 4-year-old Idris Lockett won 2019's Best Halloween Costume Contest for his impersonation of Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. His mother, Catherine, had picked Idris up from her cousin's home and found him in a jacket that was way too large for his little frame. The visual reminded Catherine of the city's new mayor, who often wore suits that exceeded the limits of her arms and legs. Sporting a blazer, pearls, and sprayed gray hair, Idris Lockett was called the mini-mayor by his family. The hilarious look went viral, and the mayor's office posted on social media, "Nailed it." Lightfoot took notice of the adorable news stories and invited Idris, who had survived 3 surgeries to fix an underdeveloped heart, to City Hall for pizza. Nearly 4 years later, Idris Lockett took an excused day from school to attend Lightfoot's final city council meeting with his mother. They brought her a bouquet of roses and sat through 5 hours of aldermanic speeches, hoping to get a moment with the mayor and say thank you. She didn't give it to them. "I don't know what she had going on," Catherine told me, disappointed. "I just wish she could have come out in good faith." Lockett wasn't the day's only snub. Lightfoot's mayoral predecessors had given speeches to the departing alderpersons touting their records together, but she was silent. Lightfoot told staff she didn't want to give multiple farewell addresses, but city council members took it as one final act of contempt for their institution. Alderperson Tom Tunney, who vacillated between being Lightfoot's friend and foe over the years, texted to invite her to a gathering afterward with alderpersons. "I will not be in attendance," she texted back. "It's better that you all enjoy yourselves without my presence." Lightfoot also skipped the customary post-council news conference in what essentially amounted to a press boycott after losing re-election. The day's events highlighted how much had changed in 4 years for Lightfoot and the city of Chicago. She entered the mayor's office with enormous promise, winning all 50 city wards against a political titan, only to be rejected by more than 80% of the city's voters, making her Chicago's first incumbent to lose re-election since 1983. Lightfoot's early months as mayor gave residents hope for change, safety, equity, ethics. But by the end, residents saw her tenure as a series of missed opportunities. Even though she landed a series of significant achievements, from pushing economic development as part of the Invest Southwest initiative, securing a casino to boost Chicago finances, earning credit rating upgrades, and moving the Red Line South extension steadily forward, Lightfoot's victories were overshadowed by her failures to bring people together. For her part, Lightfoot blamed the media. "We just literally need to go door to door, because the cynical, we only care about website clicks press will never give any of us, at any level, a fair shake," she once texted U.S. Representative Robin Kelly. The rise and fall of Mayor Lori Lightfoot raises important questions. How did she go from political wunderkind, promising to make Chicago the safest big city in America, change its culture of corruption and villainy, and reform the long-troubled police department, to sulking on her way out of City Hall? What can leaders across the country learn from Lightfoot and Chicago's experience about modern governance and the big issues facing cities? Where does the 3rd largest city in America go from here? Andre Vasquez, a former rapper turned Chicago alderperson, tightly summarized the problems Lightfoot faced through her only term in office. "It is objectively true that you had the hardest hand dealt to you of any mayor in the history of the city of Chicago. Roswell B. Mason, mayor during 1871's Great Chicago Fire, might quibble if he weren't dead. But the years 2019 to 2023 were indeed plagued by unforeseen catastrophes, from the global COVID-19 pandemic to civil unrest prompted by the police murder of George Floyd, which exacerbated Chicago's deep segregation and stirred tension over the dark legacy of misconduct by local cops. No one could blame Lightfoot for causing these compounding crises. But that isn't the whole story. First-term Governor J.B. Pritzker drew the same bad hand with Lightfoot and managed to fare far better, now serving his 2nd term. An old political axiom often quoted at City Hall notes, "There are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, just permanent interests." In 4 years, Lightfoot managed to inflame them all with her handling of issues and fiery response to negative feedback, which included a defiant declaration that 99% of the criticism she received is racist and sexist. Manny Perez, a political operative who helped run Jesus Chuy Garcia's campaign for Chicago mayor in 2015 and helmed Lightfoot's successful runoff bid in 2019, has a saying: "Every campaign is on a path of self-destruction." Sometimes that's people fighting inside, destroying it from within. Other times, it's external forces crushing candidacies. The question is, what comes first, Election Day or self-destruction? Lightfoot made it to 2019 Election Day without self-destructing. Could she do it again? To give herself a chance at making the April 2023 runoff, Lightfoot needed black voters to back her campaign, and just enough white progressives along the lakefront who supported her original run to stay loyal. If that happened, Lightfoot thought she could pull off a win. Lightfoot understood that elections force choices between sometimes unpalatable options. Every campaign is an exercise in disproving the old adage, "I wouldn't date you if you were the last man on earth." When she was elected in 2019, Lightfoot seemed blessed with extraordinary political luck and skill. Her win of all 50 wards included her opponent's home base in Hyde Park. Before pivoting to politics, Lightfoot had broken barriers as one of the few black female equity partners in the law firm Mayer Brown, and had been a federal prosecutor. She was primarily known for her toughness and using her fighting skills to pound on her rivals. That worked for a campaign that turned into a brawl over government ethics and the other candidate's ties to indicted alderperson Edward Burke. To succeed in office, she would need to take a more strategic tack, which she proved herself incapable of taking. I think back sometimes to a comment Lightfoot made to me just before an anti-violence march. Noticing a couple ornate chess sets hand-carved by members of a church in the back of the Yards neighborhood, I asked Lightfoot if she played. She chuckled and responded that she's more of a checkers player. Her brother tried to teach her, Lightfoot said, but she wasn't able to get into the game. It showed over the next 4 years of chaos. Heading into the February 2023 Chicago mayoral election, Lightfoot faced 8 opponents, nearly all of them black. There was only one certainty as the voters made their choice. The only white candidate, former Chicago Public School CEO Paul Vallis, would be headed for a runoff between the top vote-getters. Lightfoot was more than okay with that. The incumbent mayor was deeply unpopular with Chicago residents, who were disturbed by her combative style, dissatisfied with high crime, and distressed over diminishing quality of life, including frequent disruptions to schools and public transit service. But Lightfoot thought she could fight her way into the second round, then exploit Vallis's toxic association with conservative Republicans and lack of charisma to beat him. In some ways, Lightfoot wanted to imitate the strategy Pritzker used to secure his own re-election: support the most conservative rival in the Republican primary, then coast to victory by reminding overwhelmingly Democratic voters and independents that the opposing candidate has taken extreme policy positions. The difference between Lightfoot and Pritzker, however, could be measured by his high job approval rating compared to her far worse marks from residents, as well as the vast difference between their campaign war chests. The billionaire governor spent millions to tear down a more moderate primary rival and build up Darren Bailey, a Republican state senator who had advocated for the rest of Illinois separating from Chicago, while Lightfoot struggled to raise enough cash to get her own message out. Still, Lightfoot knew many of the Chicago residents most dissatisfied with her leadership would still rather vote for her than a Republican. And while Vallis had, in fact, been a lifelong Democrat, he spent years flirting with extreme conservatives and took money from right-wing donors, making him a tough sell to a large swath of Chicago. As Election Day approached, Lightfoot's team knew she faced a fight, but thought she was in a decent position. Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia had entered the race as a presumed frontrunner, well known from his 2015 run against Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and generally well-liked. Lightfoot considered him a real threat, so she blasted away at him in campaign commercials, depicting him as a crook. Garcia barely responded, and didn't launch his own commercials until weeks later. In the meantime, Garcia spoke in platitudes and shied away from the progressive policy positions that helped make him a household name. He never recovered the momentum he had on day one of the race. While Lightfoot tried to cut off Garcia, she reserved special scorn for Brandon Johnson, a Cook County commissioner and former educator backed by the Chicago Teachers Union, CTU, which had been her most vociferous critic since the 2019 election. For months, Lightfoot's strategy was to mostly ignore Johnson, believing that he lacked the name recognition to be a real threat. At one campaign stop that January, Lightfoot even mocked the CTU for giving him their support. They've endorsed Brandon Johnson. God bless. Brandon Johnson isn't going to be mayor of this city. At the time she made that remark, however, Johnson was steadily rising in the polls, making connections with voters, performing well in debates, and charming the city. During one forum, Vallis mistakenly called him Dr. Johnson, and he quipped back that Vallis had added $100,000 to my student loans. CTU President Stacey Davis Gates had been one of Johnson's top supporters for years. She believed in him. She thought he could win. So she put her energy and significant clout toward making it happen. But she understood Lightfoot remained dangerous and never underestimated her. As an incumbent, Lightfoot could never be counted out, especially not in this city. Chicago doesn't know how to break up with its mayor, Davis Gates said. Lightfoot's rise to power would have been unfathomable through most of Chicago's history. For much of the 20th century and into the 21st, the city of Chicago had been ruled by a small circle of men and their political machine. Richard J. Daley reigned as Chicago's boss for 21 years, from 1955 to 1976, through the construction of O'Hare International Airport and the Sears Tower, until his death. His son, Richard M. Daley, surpassed his father's record by 1 year, governing the city from 1989 to 2011, and leading a campaign to reinvigorate and beautify downtown at a time when people feared Chicago would decline. When Richard M. walked away from City Hall, the Daley family watched as his former lead fundraiser, Rahm Emanuel, took the throne. Daley's effort to keep Chicago an attractive place to live also left the city with enormous financial problems due to his refusal to meaningfully raise taxes or cut services, leaving Emanuel with huge budget holes that he plugged with the largest property tax increase in the city's history. Emanuel, who had previously spent 3 terms in the House of Representatives, followed by a stint as Barack Obama's chief of staff, worked tirelessly to spur corporate relocations to downtown, part of a strategy aimed at growing Chicago's tax base and gentrifying the city. The strategy was successful, but it led to criticism that Emanuel was Mayor 1% and that he was only deepening Chicago's inequities. Under Emanuel, a narrative took hold that Chicago was a tale of 2 cities. Nobody pushed that criticism harder than Johnson and his allies, whose political philosophy was encapsulated by the slogan, "For the many, not the few." Despite criticism over his handling of the Laquan McDonald police murder, Emanuel had significant institutional support and political ambition. So his announcement in September 2018 that he wouldn't seek re-election stunned Chicago. Without an heir apparent, it also created a real sense of a city up for grabs. This has been the job of a lifetime, but it is not a job for a lifetime, Emanuel said, drawing one big question: who would lead Chicago? Lightfoot had already entered at a time when other people were afraid of Goliath. Political heavyweights who had been afraid to take on Emanuel now scrambled to join the race for City Hall's top job. A historic field of 14 candidates jockeyed to be mayor, including the youngest Daley son, Bill, who had succeeded Emanuel as Obama's White House chief of staff, and now threw his hat in the ring to continue the family business. Illinois Comptroller Susan Mendoza, a rising star in the state Democratic Party, and Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle, who was the Democratic Party boss of Cook County. Federal prosecutors further roiled Chicago that November when FBI agents raided the office of powerful alderperson Edward Burke, a 50-year veteran of the city council who was suspected of extorting local businesses and had ties to all the new entrants, but not to Lightfoot, who was still an underdog. As they plastered Burke's office windows with brown paper to hide their actions from reporters gawking outside, The feds transformed the electoral landscape into a battle between new and old, insider and outsider. Burke was re-elected, but lost all power as he resigned his chairmanship of the powerful City Council Finance Committee, creating drastic change for local government. Against this backdrop, Chicago residents cast their ballots on February 26, 2019, and through a plurality, chose a candidate no one had seen coming, the political novice, Lori Lightfoot. In the ensuing runoff, Lightfoot defeated Preckwinkle with 74% of the vote. That's the sort of margin both dailies used to run up against political has-beens and nobodies. It was a stunning victory. As a first-time candidate with limited experience, Lightfoot presented an unprecedented blank slate to Chicago voters. No one expected her to win, and it was impossible to predict how she would govern. Yet the stakes couldn't have been higher. As a city, Chicago faced enormous headwinds. In the 2020 census, Chicago gained a small amount of population, but lost hundreds of thousands of black residents. Chicago's black population dropped 10% in the 2020 census, and went from more than 1 million 20 years ago to fewer than 800,000, leaving swaths of the South and West Sides empty. The result was a number of struggling neighborhoods often overlooked by the rich and powerful. Alarmists have for decades said Chicago is at risk of becoming Detroit, but that comparison has never proved apt. The city's economy is more diverse and vibrant. Its location next to Lake Michigan, too strong a lure for tourists and people trying to make a new life. The home of former President Barack Obama remains a metropolis, with major sports teams in each sport, one of the world's busiest airports, and several prestigious research universities. But what Chicago could face is a situation more akin to Philadelphia than New York, a perfectly lovely regional town, but not a world-class city. Whether Chicago can maintain its global status is, undoubtedly, dependent on its political leadership and vision. For 4 years, that political leadership belonged to Lightfoot. Some of Chicago's problems can be explained by forces greater than the mayor: national polarization, long-standing cultural and racial tensions, our plague years. But some are the result of her poor leadership at City Hall, a story that hasn't been told in full, until now. I covered Lightfoot for the Chicago Tribune from the beginning of her political career, when she was a long-shot candidate, and some of my colleagues thought she wasn't worth the time of day. We developed a strong relationship of mutual respect and shared humor. When editors asked me to follow her around during the first mayoral runoff, she texted me, "I heard you were being assigned to cover our campaign for the duration. A plus in my book." One day, I recommended she watch Bird Box, a horror film starring Sandra Bullock. After she watched it, Lightfoot approached me at a news conference to whisper, "That movie scared the shit out of me." Our relationship changed over the 4 years that I covered her turbulent term in office, which included crime spikes, a teacher strike, and a series of bitter feuds with alderpersons and state legislators. As her administration struggled, her interactions with me, as with many other members of the press, became less genial and often combative. She once emailed staff, "There will be nothing given as placed stories or friendly background to Greg Pratt," and ordered them to, under no circumstances, give me anything proactively. "Are we clear?" she wrote. Later, at a public news conference, she attacked me for raising a question about withholding body cam video from a police raid victim, calling me reckless and irresponsible, unfortunately now a pattern of his stretching back for months. The next day, she publicly apologized to me after a team informed her that she was wrong on the facts. Through thousands of conversations with hundreds of sources, I've developed a strong understanding of how City Hall works, and how it doesn't. Chicago has been a flashpoint in every major issue facing the United States, from income inequality and segregation to crime and poverty. In recent years, all of these issues have been magnified by the global pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and a racial reckoning in the country. Under Lightfoot, I've watched Chicago wrestle with COVID-19, and 2 rounds of riots that deeply harmed the city's psyche, and continue to grapple with inequality in the public schools, and the city more broadly. Consider Chicago's 1st Congressional District, which stretches from Streeterville and Navy Pier downtown to the impoverished neighborhood of West Englewood. It has a life expectancy gap of 30 years. People live on average to 90 in Streeterville, but just to 60 on the south side. The median income is $100,000 in Streeterville, but only about a quarter of that in West Englewood. More than anything, the city under Lightfoot struggled with crime and stalled police reform. In 2018, Chicago recorded 561 homicides, and that dropped to a still astonishing 492 in 2019, according to police statistics. By the end of 2021, that figure had spiked to more than 800, an astounding increase Lightfoot attributed to the pandemic and a lax judicial system, though critics said her police department has also contributed to the rise with poor leadership and misuse of resources. Perhaps her most consequential decision as mayor was to hire a former Dallas police superintendent, David Brown, as top cop. In Chicago, he struggled to fit in and left the department floundering. In 2021, more than 1,000 officers quit, but only 315 were replaced. Arrests were down by thousands. Morale was low. As a candidate, Lightfoot promised she wouldn't lead with her middle finger, a reference to her predecessor, Emanuel, who mailed a dead fish to a former colleague when he was young and making his name in politics. Despite her promise, Lightfoot's time in office saw a series of controversies, often created or exacerbated by the mayor's combative style. She has taken an approach to governance that led alderperson Susan Sidlowski Garza, a longtime ally, to summarize her time in office this way. I have never met anybody who has managed to piss off every single person they come in contact with. Police, fire, teachers, aldermen, businesses, manufacturing. The title of this book is drawn from a text message Lightfoot sent amid the riots in 2020, when she was exasperated with an alderperson's concern for the civil rights of people caught downtown. But it applies broadly to the political landscape she benefited from in 2019 and left behind. By the time Lightfoot sought re-election in 2023, the city was again up for grabs. She lost in the first round, defeated by Vallis and Johnson, two candidates who expressed polar extremes of the political spectrum. Eventually, the candidate she had most dismissed, Johnson, would emerge victorious to helm the city. In some ways, the past 4 years of Lightfoot's tenure as mayor are a model for how not to lead a big city. Her failures weakened the office. She lost control of Chicago public schools, alienated former supporters, and drove segments of the city crazy. Yet, there's undeniably a lot to admire about Lightfoot. The job requires toughness, her most abundant quality. Most of all, she cared deeply about equity in a segregated city. Over the many months I spent writing this book, people asked me if Lightfoot was aware I was writing it. She was. I'll always remember the way she glared at me the first time we saw each other after I informed her communications director, Kate Lafergie, that I was writing the book. To my regret, Lightfoot declined to participate in interviews or address questions about specific incidents mentioned in the book. While I'm disappointed by the mayor's position, it doesn't change my ability to tell the story of the past 4 years in Chicago, which I spent sitting in the front row at City Hall, watching the power players, good government goo-goos, optimists, wannabes, has-beens, never-wases, and scoundrels jockey for influence. I hope you will learn from the good, the bad, and the ugly. 1. The Breach, November 19, 2015. Southside activist Will Calloway packed into Cook County Judge Franklin Valderrama's 23rd floor courtroom at the Daly Center across from City Hall, alongside community leaders, reporters, and lawyers to hear the judge's ruling in a case with deep implications for Chicago and the nation. Calloway had been involved with the city's police accountability movement since 2012, when he met Martinez Sutton, the grieving brother of police shooting victim Rekia Boyd. A devout Christian, Calloway spent the days leading up to the hearing praying for a just ruling. The issue before Valderrama was whether Mayor Rahm Emanuel's administration broke the law by withholding police dashcam video of a white officer shooting a black teenager 16 times. Emanuel lawyers argued the release would interfere with an FBI investigation into the killing. At the time, ongoing investigation was a common rationale to withhold footage of police officers shooting people, and the case would determine whether law enforcement would continue to shroud potential misconduct in secrecy. Valderrama's ruling also had the potential to reshape Chicago's relationship with its government and police department by exposing a profound injustice. The October 20th, 2014 shooting incident had started with a 911 caller reporting that a young man was breaking into trucks near 41st Street and Kildare Avenue on the working-class southwest side. Responding police officers followed Laquan McDonald near a Burger King parking lot, where he walked with a knife in hand before he was shot by Officer Jason Van Dyke. Fraternal Order of Police spokesman Pat Camden told media at the scene that McDonald ignored orders to drop the weapon and lunged at officers, leaving them no choice but to shoot him. McDonald, Camden said, had a 100-yard stare. Valderrama ordered the city to release the video, which fully exposed a cascade of lies about McDonald's murder. Following the judge's order, Chicago stood on edge as its residents absorbed one of the largest breaches of public trust in the city's history. The police story of McDonald's killing had been unraveling for months. In a February 2015 article for Slate, journalist Jamie Calvin reported on the basis of the autopsy report that the boy had been shot 16 times, front and back, and made known the existence of dashcam footage that captured the incident. Chicago police have told their version of how 17-year-old black teen Laquan McDonald died. The subhead read, "The autopsy tells a different story." Calvin's story quoted the autopsy report and described McDonald clearly. 6 feet tall and 180 pounds, he had been wearing blue jeans and a black hooded sweatshirt. He had dreadlocks, the longest of which was 5 inches. He was, before the encounter with the police, in good health. A tattoo on his upper right arm read, Quan. Another, on the back of his right hand, read, Good Son. And on the back of his left hand were a pair of dice, and YOLO, the acronym for You Only Live Once. The story noted inconsistencies between officers' version of events and the bullet holes in his body. It later won a national award for exposing the truth. But it didn't draw much immediate public attention or outrage, even as Emanuel was campaigning for a second term. In April, the newly re-elected mayor's administration agreed to pay McDonald's family $5 million to settle the case before a lawsuit was even filed. The city's top lawyer, Stephen Patton, testified at a city council committee hearing. The plaintiffs contend very vehemently that Mr. McDonald had been walking away from the police and was continuing to walk away from the police, and they contend that the videotape supports their version of the events. None of the alderpersons present challenged the settlement in any meaningful way, though Burke, a longtime police supporter whose ward housed the Burger King, questioned why responding officers didn't have tasers. Patton considered the settlement a smart use of city's resources and an effective way to handle lawsuits stemming from police misconduct. Closing a hot case early, saving the taxpayer money in attorney's fees and judgments. But to others, it reeked, particularly as the Emanuel administration fought to keep the video secret. Southside alderperson Howard Brookins, who doubled as a criminal defense attorney, was later critical of the city for withholding the footage. "I'm not worried about rioting or demonstrations. I need this to stop," Brookins said, according to the Chicago Sun-Times. "If you don't show the video and this continues to happen, then we're still headed down that path." The Emanuel administration's argument for not releasing the video was plausible. It had long been the practice to withhold such evidence while investigations were pending, after all. But it proved to be illegal. The Illinois Freedom of Information Act is clear that only government bodies actively doing an investigation can withhold the records. That means you can't file a request to get the records directly from the FBI if the Department of Justice is reviewing the case. But you can request them from the government body that keeps the records, in this case, Chicago. Callaway, an activist from South Shore, and independent journalist Brandon Smith sued the police department for the video, which culminated in the judge's order. The footage showed McDonald walking away as officers followed him from a safe distance. The situation is tense but under control when Van Dyke arrives on the scene and opens fire, unloading 16 times in what is essentially an execution. His partner kicks the knife away from McDonald's limp body. None of the officers attempts to render aid. While Calvin's story exposed the wrongdoing, acts of violence best encapsulate the expression, A picture is worth 1,000 words. It's one thing to be told the shooting is wrong. It's another to watch footage.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?